Efforts are underway to ensure that the violent confrontation between Israel and Hamas does not escalate into a broader regional conflict. So what's on President Yoon Suk Yeol's agenda in the Middle East? What has been the response to US President Joe Biden's endeavors on containing the conflict? And where does Russia and China stand on the matter? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we explore the efforts underway to address the violence in the Middle East. For more on this, I have Professor Choi Hyun Jin from Kyung Hee University here in the studio with me. Professor Choi, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
I also have Kwon Soa with us. Soa, welcome back.
I'm happy to be back.
Right, Professor Choi, let's begin with you. Let's begin with a few words then on the importance of the Middle East for the broader international community, including South Korea, of course. Simply speaking, Professor Choi, why does the Middle East matter?
The Middle East is getting a lot of international attention nowadays. But why does the Middle East get so much attention? So I think there are three important reasons. The first reason is it is very rich in natural resources. The Middle East has huge quantities of oil and natural gas. So it has 5 of the 10 highest oil-producing countries in the world. And these resources have made many countries in the Middle East extremely rich. So the Middle East became a vital region because many countries depend on their natural resources. At the same time, the advanced countries, including South Korea, have been looking at the Middle East as a place of new investment opportunities as well. And the second reason is its geopolitical location. The Middle East sits at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. And therefore, it is the heart of the global economy. For example, the Middle East has the largest airport in the world, that is King Fahd International Airport in Saudi Arabia. And the Suez Canal is perhaps the most vital waterway in the world, connecting Europe and Asia. And the third reason is rather a negative one. There is a massive potential for armed conflict in the Middle East. So since 1960, the Middle East has seen more than 60 wars. And recently, the wars in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and also Israel-Palestine have all drawn international attention. And moreover, the wars in the Middle East have the potential to pull in major powers, such as Russia in Syria, and America in Iraq and Israel, and also NATO in Libya. And sadly, the underlying causes of this war still remain unresolved. And this is the reason why the Middle East is so important for global peace and stability.
Right, and against that backdrop, so our President Yoon Suk Yeol is currently in the Middle East for a 5-day state visit, of course, to address the fresh violence. And of course, it's related repercussions, including that on the economy. What more can you tell us?
Right. President Yoon is in the middle of his trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar that started on Saturday. And it is the first time for a sitting South Korean president to make a state visit to these countries. And the focus for both of these trips will be on the economy, security cooperation, and the Israel-Hamas war. So from Saturday to Tuesday, President Yoon is in Riyadh, including with a summit with Saudi Crown Prince, and he's also the Prime Minister, Mohammed bin Salman, plus 4 economic events. Speaking of economic events, a 130-member business delegation is accompanying Yoon. So let me get into the developments from President Yoon's meeting with the Saudi prince. The two decided to deepen and develop the Korea-Saudi strategic partnership. They signed 51 deals and MOUs, and the two countries are reportedly in the final stage of large-scale defense industry cooperation talks. That could be in areas such as anti-aircraft defense systems and weapons. According to Principal Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Tae-hyo, the collaborations are not going to be a one-time event. He described it as a long-term and also used words like systematic. And a joint statement is to be released on all of those fields of cooperation, also issues regarding the Israel-Hamas conflict, the war in Ukraine, as well as the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Now, President Yoon and Crown Prince bin Salman exchanged views on the instabilities in the Middle East, while Yoon said the South Korean government would cooperate with necessary means, including humanitarian aid. And earlier, it had been hinted that a plan on assisting civilian casualties and refugees is to be included. When asked by reporters on the chance of Korean troops being deployed into the region, an official said that Seoul is not at the stage to consider direct political or military involvement. Now, on Tuesday, meanwhile, President Yoon will head to Qatar's Doha, where he will sit down with Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. And a bilateral summit is going to be held, and they will have lunch together on Wednesday. A Korea-Qatar Business Forum is also on the agenda, where discussions on deepening economic cooperation in the energy sector, such as in LNG, hydrogen, and solar power, are to be held, as well as talks on seeking opportunities for cooperation in new industries such as high-tech, health, and culture. Now, in Qatar, President Yoon is going to be accompanied by a 59-member economic delegation.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Choi, there are pundits who believe that a similar effort by US President Joe Biden with regard to diffusing tensions between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants, of course, last week it happened, is believed to have had limited gains. What exactly do they mean, and what are your personal thoughts regarding that?
Yes, it is. As you know, the President Biden visited Israel on last Wednesday and met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also members of the Israeli War Cabinet. And Biden advised a cautious approach to Israel's planned ground war in Gaza Strip, which has the potential to take a heavy toll on civilians. He also planned to meet with leaders of Jordan, Egypt, and also the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank to stop the ongoing war in Gaza Strip, and also to find ways to make a peace process once again. However, these three parties of Jordan, Egypt, and Palestinian Authority all canceled a planned meeting with Joe Biden after a massive blast in Gaza Strip's Al-Ali Baptist Hospital that killed hundreds of Palestinian people. And Arab countries blamed Israel for this hospital blast, while Israeli officials say that it was caused by a misfired rocket by Islamic Jihad. And not surprisingly, the President Biden sided with Israel, and saying that the hospital explosion appears to be done by the other team, not Israel. And I don't know what is the truth. But however, it seems to me that this very remark of President Biden made Middle Eastern leaders somewhat upset about Washington's near complete support for Israel. So now Arab leaders are trying to distance themselves from the United States and somehow neglect Biden as anger grows on the Arab street against Israel. And for these reasons, I think the diplomatic outcome of Biden's Israel trip was not the one we had hoped for.
Right. Professor Choi, do you suppose the host of challenges faced by the world as we speak, of course, are perhaps the greatest test of leadership for the US on the global stage? I'm of course talking about Ukraine as well as the situation between Israel and Hamas.
Okay, got it. After inauguration, the President Biden tried to maintain and increase U.S. leadership and influence on the global stage by uniting with its traditional allies on a common front. And he had strengthened various networks such as the Quad and AUKUS with Australia, and also trilateral cooperation with Korea and Japan. And as a result, U.S. leadership was gradually restored. In this context, the Biden administration has been working on an important project in the Middle East. That is the normalization of a relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia under U.S. leadership, somehow to control the rising influence of China in the Middle East. However, the outbreak of a war in Israel has put this project in trouble. And this is a huge challenge for President Biden. As U.S. media reported a few weeks ago that Donald Trump's popularity is even 9% ahead of Biden. And if this war in Israel escalates into a regional war in the Middle East, and the U.S. becomes involved, it would be a major setback for Mr. Biden, I think. And moreover, the outcome of the war in Ukraine and also in Israel will determine whether liberal or authoritarian forces will dominate international politics in the future. And what would happen if the Hamas-Israel war distracted the West and also Russia won the war in Ukraine? So the power of the liberal camp led by the United States would be weakened in this situation. And the authoritarian camp centered on China, Russia, and Iran would also rise. And therefore, this is an important test for the U.S. leadership on the global stage.
Right. And so based on the coverage that we have out there, what appear to be the prospects of the U.S. and Iran perhaps being drawn visibly into this fresh conflict between Israel and Hamas?
Well, the potential roles that the U.S. and Iran could play in the conflict have gained a lot of attention because with the U.S., of course, being a close ally of Israel, and then Iran being an arch enemy to Israel, and plus Iran backs Hamas. So let me give you a quick background on Israel-Iran ties, first of all. These two used to be allies, friends, until the late 1970s. Following the Iranian Revolution, or also known as the Islamic Revolution, the new Iranian regime cut ties with Israel. Iran did not recognize the Jewish country as a legitimate state and called it an imperialist power in the Middle East, as well as an extension of the U.S. hand in the region. Iran has been supporting anti-Israel groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah financially and militarily, such as with rockets. Now, Hezbollah might not sound familiar to some. It is a militant group based in Lebanon, which also clashes regularly with Israel, and it is designated as a terrorist organization by Western countries, including by the U.S. Now, Iran and Israel have been involved in numerous tit-for-tat conflicts in past years, but have been avoiding the danger of an all-out war. But now there are fears Iran could make bigger steps, especially with Iranian officials having praised Hamas for its surprise attack on Israel. Following Israel's counterattack on Gaza, Iran warned to take action if more is to come through its so-called axis of resistance, and that would include anti-Israel and anti-Western groups like Hezbollah. However, later it seemed to be canceling these words, with the country's UN mission saying it won't intervene in the conflict unless Iranian citizens or interests come under the attack of Israel. The prospects are not definite, and the U.S. is also not ruling out the use of forces in the case Israel-Hamas war escalates with the intervention of Iran or proxies of Iran. And in fact, U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken had said that Washington does not want to see a second or third front develop, but if it does happen, the U.S. will be ready to respond decisively.
Right. And Professor Choi, this is something you touched upon earlier, but bluntly speaking, what does Russia stand to gain from the conflict between Israel and Hamas?
There was an interesting magazine article recently. An American politics magazine, Politico, called this conflict Hamas' gift to Putin. And the conflict between Israel and Hamas is good for Russia for two main reasons. So it diverts international attention away from the war in Ukraine and also weakens Western support for Ukraine. So let me begin from the first reason. So experts say that the conflict has shifted the Western focus from the war in Ukraine to the Middle East. And especially the United States has been busy reaching out to its traditional ally, Israel. And if Iranian-backed Lebanese militant group, that is Hezbollah, gets involved in this war, the United States is considering even a scenario that includes U.S. troops. And for this reason, a U.S. security think tank, Stimson Center, said like this: a more direct U.S. involvement in the Israeli-Hamas war could reverse the Biden administration's position of focusing on Ukraine. And the second reason, the Western support for Ukraine is likely to decrease for the first reason. And if the conflict between Israel and Hamas turns to a protracted war, the U.S. will be less able to support Ukraine. And for this reason, one Russian diplomat said like this: the West is unlikely to abandon Ukraine, but the amount of military assistance to Ukraine will gradually decrease. And the situation may unfold in Russia's favor. And that's why many Russian experts somehow welcome the current instability in the Middle East.
I see. In the meantime, though, so I believe the Biden administration, for its part, has reaffirmed its support, firm support that is, for both Israel and Ukraine, right?
Right. Although the two wars may differ in nature and background, it appears that the Biden administration is trying to link those two conflicts in a bid to equally support Ukraine and Israel, as well as those needing humanitarian aid amid the devastating situations. Now, U.S. President Biden had a speech at the Oval Office on Thursday, and he said, quote, "Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy." And he also stressed that providing aid to Israel and Ukraine is a smart investment for the U.S. people's security for generations, and that helping both countries win in their wars would keep American troops away from danger. Although Professor Choi mentioned that it could happen that the U.S. has its troops later on with the developments of the war. Apart from promising his backing for Israel and Ukraine, Biden also emphasized the humanitarian aspect regarding the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian people that need help and must be distinguished from Hamas. In a move to reassure support for Ukraine, Biden called Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky prior to his speech on Thursday to tell him the U.S. will continue to back Kyiv. There's been growing divide over continuing aid to Ukraine from hardline Republicans, making Biden's request a challenge. And in figures, Biden is seeking a roughly $105 billion aid package that would include more than $61 billion for Ukraine, including for weapons supply, military intelligence support, and assistance for displaced Ukrainians arriving in the U.S., and some $14 billion for Israel, including a strengthening of Israel's Iron Dome air defense system, and also other security needs in Taiwan and the U.S. southern border. So in terms of money, it might seem that there is a difference because more than $60 billion for Ukraine and $14 for Israel. But as I mentioned at the beginning, it's the level of the importance of how much support the U.S. wants to give to each of these situations.
Right, indeed. Professor Choi, where does neighboring China stand amid this latest conflict between Israel and Hamas?
I think China wants to be a neutral peace broker, calling for restraint and also ceasefire, but it has not condemned Hamas, who actually started the crisis. China's initial response was very neutral and diplomatic, asking all relevant parties to remain calm, exercise restraint, and immediately end hostilities. And China also declared that it opposes and condemns acts that harm civilians. So China's such response is somehow based on its long-standing policy of non-interference in domestic affairs of other countries. Others also see that China's unwillingness to condemn Hamas and its calls for an end to violence on both sides may be driven by its economic interests in the Middle East. So, for example, the countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and also Iran are rapidly deepening their economic cooperation with China. In particular, Chinese investments and construction projects in Saudi Arabia have totaled about $56 billion. And therefore, China has many economic interests in the Middle East, and Beijing always views instability in this region as a major threat to Chinese interests. And therefore, this China's neutral stance around the crisis in Gaza Strips, like an attempt to maintain its favorable relationship with the most Arabian countries nowadays.
Right. Meanwhile, so how are other global leaders perhaps responding to the rampant brutal confrontation between these two sides, Israel and Hamas?
Well, it's been now more than 2 weeks into the turmoil. There were a lot of responses. So let's look at some of the recent ones. Key Western leaders on Sunday have issued a joint statement giving their support for Israel and its right to defend itself. That's the U.S., Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Britain, whose leaders held a virtual meeting. And they also, however, urged Israel to abide by international humanitarian law and protect civilians. The statement also welcomed the release of 2 hostages held by Hamas. And now taking you to Cairo, or the peace summit there over the weekend, which focused on finding ways to de-escalate the situation in Gaza. And there were some mixed responses there. Arab and Muslim leaders there denounced Israel's bombardment of Gaza, such as Jordan's King Abdullah, who criticized what he called global silence regarding Israel's attacks, which too have killed thousands in Gaza, calling for an equal approach to the conflict. Western countries there at the venue mainly voiced the need for humanitarian support for civilians. And as was expected, there was no breakthrough or joint statement at that particular summit.
Right, but I'm sure there was a broader consensus on the idea of protecting civilians from this armed conflict. All right, so as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Choi, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we say goodbye with our prayers to all the civilians there in the Middle East. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us again same time tomorrow.